Esther chapter 5. Well, we had an eventful week at our house this week, but we all survived. I was in charge of Lila off and on and kept her pretty content, but that was really my goal, was to just keep her happy and alive. So, yeah. Mom made it home Wednesday. She's doing well. She's still got a lot of limitations, but she's home and doing well there. And Hatcher got here Monday afternoon, and he's doing fine. And so anyhow, Esther chapter 5. We left off last week. Esther asked Mordecai and all the Jews in Shushan to pray that as she goes into King Ahasuerus, that she would be accepted. And we're going to read here in chapter 5 that what happens after that. And throughout this entire book, and especially as we go through these next few chapters, those of us that are saved and understand how the Lord works and how sovereign He is over everything, we can clearly see the providence and sovereignty of God throughout these next few chapters, especially, and how they all play out. And I'll try to point those out as we go. But with this in mind, as we go through this chapter 5, just keep in the back of your mind, that God's hand is in all of this. And remember from last week, Haman had put out a decree with the king's blessing that all the Jews would be killed 11 months from then, in chapter 3. And they were going to have 11 months, and then at the 11th month mark, on a specific day, all the Jews in the provinces of Persia were going to be killed. And so that's why we've got the prayer meeting here in chapter 4, verse 16, and then why we have this meeting with Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus laid out here in chapter 5. So with that being said, chapter 5, verse 1, when you see there on the third day, that refers back to the third day after they begin to pray, which is referenced in chapter 4, verse 16, okay? So the third day of prayer from chapter 4 is when Esther, where it picks up here in chapter 5.
Esther 5. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter.
I got to thinking after reading this, I think we're going to start this at our house. If Tammy wants to speak to me, I'm going to have to, with the approval of my scepter, raise my scepter. Well, first of all, I got to get a scepter. I don't have one yet. But anyway, remember, no one, yeah, no one was allowed to go into the king except they be bidden to come. So Esther is taking this step of faith. Now again, they prayed for 3 days there in chapter 4, verse 16. So it's not like she's just waltzing in. She does have the power of prayer behind her. But still, this moment when the king raises his scepter to allow her to come in was a key moment here. Because if he hadn't have accepted her, then she could have faced death or at the least divorce. Remember what happened to Vashti some years ago. So we see here that he raises his scepter and allows her to come in, and then he comes to, or she comes to him there in verse 3.
Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared.
So we see this unfolding. What do you want? Up to half the kingdom. Now, I did read that this phrase that they would grant up to half the kingdom was basically hyperbole. That wasn't necessarily a literal grant that a king would give, but it was hype. What do you want, and I'll give it to you, essentially, is what he's saying there. Esther says, I want you and Haman to come to this banquet that I'm going to throw. That's all she said. I'm going to throw it today, but later on today. And the king was pleased with that. Okay, so make Haman to come haste. And they go to the banquet that Esther has prepared. All right, so this all transpires in the same time frame of the same morning, you could say, or the same day. I want you and Haman to come to this banquet that I'm going to throw today. Now, this is important, okay? And king approves, said, make sure that Haman gets here in haste. Chop, chop. Verse 6.
And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said.
So this was funny to me as I read through this. The king and Haman are there at the banquet. The king asked Esther, what do you want, Esther? Up to half the kingdom. She said, well, I'd like for you guys to come to a banquet tomorrow. Now, we can see perhaps she was scared. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to go about this. Perhaps we could say that about her. I don't know, because Scripture doesn't really say why she put it off until tomorrow. But we will see as the banquet tomorrow takes place, how the Lord's hand was in all of this. Okay? So perhaps at this time, we'll just say this, that God was not yet ready for Esther to give her request. And so Esther says, I'm going to have a banquet tomorrow. Come tomorrow. Now again, why? We're just going to say that this was the Lord's doings. Because the way it all plays out, it would not have played out had it all played out today. Does everybody understand? So it's going to work better tomorrow if y'all just come tomorrow. Okay? Now remember, Haman is King Ahasuerus' right-hand man. And he's full of pride. We've seen that played out in chapter 2 especially. But we're going to see Haman's pride get in the way of his life and ultimately lead to his doom. But we will see here, remember that King Ahasuerus and Haman are the only guests here at this banquet. All right? Or at least they're the only ones that we know of. Verse 9.
Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless Haman refrained himself. And when he came home, he sent and called for his friends, and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king.
Haman's feeling pretty good about himself. Yeah, he's ticked off that Mordecai won't bow to him. But hey, look at all this stuff that I have. The king's promoted me. I'm the second in command. I've got all this stuff. The queen, she's even invited me to a banquet today that I'm just coming, and I'm going to go back to a banquet tomorrow. And I'm sure he's thinking, all this being in my honor, because look how great I am. Pretty full of himself. Now, he's got Mordecai and a thorn in his side, but his wife has an idea about Mordecai here in verse 13 and 14.
In all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made.
So his wife says, if you don't like Mordecai, just hang him. Get the blessing of the king and hang him on a gallows. Now, 50 cubits is about 75 feet. So you could see this gallows from quite a ways. I say gallows, I always think of red and white. Let's see, Bethany. I was gonna gallows, red and white. Anyway, 75 feet. Now, I will say that this proves, because they're going to make the gallows, this proves that government can move quickly if it wants to, because Haman's wife says, "Well, just build a gallows," and lo and behold, the next day it's built. So if they want to get busy and get something done, they can. Well, that's true. Yeah. Hey, you're on video, or you're on audio here, Ron. But understand, he is so full of himself and so proud of all the things that's come, but he can't get past the fact that Mordecai won't bow down to him. What does all of this that I have mean if Mordecai won't bow? Sometimes you just got to ignore your haters. But again, this hatred for Mordecai is going to come back and get Haman here in just a little bit. But it's his wife's idea to have Mordecai hanged, however you say it. 75 feet high. That. I wonder how high the steeple is here. It's probably not 75 feet. So, I don't know.
It's got to be close. I can't remember how tall it is.
We'll need to go out and measure that on a day when it's not 3 degrees. Anyway, 75 feet. Huh?
It's only 3 degrees.
Well, yeah. Comments or questions on chapter 5? That went rather quickly, but we see how it is all unfolding here. There's not much commentary that needs. All right. Chapter 6 is where the action happens and picks up here. So it's the... Huh?
I don't know.
You all right, Alexis?
No.
Oh. All right, let's move to chapter 6. It's the next day. Well, it's the night of that day of the first banquet.
Esther 6.
Now, before we get into chapter 6, well, let's read... well, let's go back to chapter 2 before we start chapter 6. Go back to chapter 2. Now, this event here in chapter 2 perhaps happened 3 or 4 years prior to the events of chapter 6. Okay? And we see here in Esther chapter 2, beginning in verse 21, you may remember when we talked about this a few weeks ago. In those days, while Mordecai sat in verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when an inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So here in Esther chapter 2, verse 21 through 23, we read about a assassination plot against the king that Mordecai foiled. And if you look at chapter 3, verse 1, after those things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman. So Mordecai was never rewarded by the deeds that he did in Esther chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. Okay? Fast forward now let's just say 3 or 4 years or so, and we get to Esther chapter 6. It's the night of that banquet that was held in chapter 5. And we get here now to that night in Esther chapter 6, beginning in verse 1.
On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king.
Remember what we read there back in chapter 2, verse 23? The thing that Mordecai did was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Fast forward now 3 or 4 years, the king has a sleepless night, and he commands that someone bring and read the records of the Chronicles. Just grab a book off the shelf and come and read to me. Now, I don't know how many books of the Chronicles there were. Ahasuerus was not the first Persian king, And we know that the Persians kept detailed records of all their government work. So this Chamberlain, I'll say, goes and grabs a book off the shelf. And verse 2.
And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus.
So the Chamberlain goes in, grabs a book off the shelf that just happens to be the one that recorded Mordecai's heroism. He just happens to open the book to the page that Mordecai's heroism is recorded on, and he reads that to the king. Now, all this is just coincidence, is it not, right? No. This is all by the providence and sovereignty of God, that of all the books that he could have chosen, out of all the pages that had history written on it, he reaches up and grabs the one that talks about Mordecai saving the king's life. This is very important. Keep in mind what we read in chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. He was never recognized for that. Now again, 3 or 4 years later, we're reading about this in front of the king. And we say here in verse 3 of chapter 6.
And the king said, What honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, There is nothing done for him.
So perhaps the people remembered that Mordecai wasn't honored. Perhaps there was nothing recorded, so they just said nothing because it wasn't recorded. We don't know. Perhaps they remembered, and they also remembered that he was never honored. But the king here is perplexed. Well, why didn't we honor this man who saved my life? Verse 4.
And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house, to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him.
So all this is going on. The gallows is being built, and Haman goes into the king to talk about the gallows that we're going to hang Mordecai on. You see, all this is just playing out perfectly for everybody but Haman. I mean, if you've never read the story of Esther and this is the first time, you probably can get some sense of an idea of what's about to happen.
And the king's servants said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in. And the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to honor more than to myself?
So, can we see what's happening? The king says, if I'm going to honor somebody, what should I do to honor him? And obviously Haman's thinking, he wants to honor me. Look at how great I am. And that's what he says there in verse 6, apparently to himself. Who would the king delight to do more honor than to me? So Haman has a plan here. Verse 7. I love this.
And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighted to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor.
Now again, Haman thinks that this parade and this ceremony is going to be for himself. You know, it's funny because the king in verse 6 never said who he was talking about. And so we can see here how, have we ever jumped to conclusions? Yeah. And we see here, though, that Haman jumping to conclusions led to his downfall. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions about things or people. But I know I'm guilty, and you are too. You just don't want to admit it in front of everybody. So anyway, let's have a big parade. Let's celebrate. Put him on a horseback. Put him with a king's robe, and put him this headdress. Verse 10.
And the king said to Haman, Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate, let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken.
Poor old Haman, now he's got to go and give this honor himself. He's not going to, the king didn't tell him to have somebody go do this. Haman himself has to go to Mordecai and give him this royal apparel. He's the one that has to present Mordecai, his arch enemy. He's the one that has to go do it. Now, that would be a tough pill to swallow, especially knowing that Haman is doing everything he can to get Mordecai killed by the end of the day. And I don't know, in the back of his mind, if he's plotting in some way to have Mordecai killed without him having his hands on it. I don't know. But the fact is that, again, remember, Haman's goal here is to have Mordecai killed. And now all of a sudden the king has commanded him to go and honor Mordecai. Verse 11.
Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife, and all his friends, everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men, and Zeresh his wife unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared.
All this is happening quickly. Yeah. So Haman goes back home all hot and bothered and upset that what he's had to do to Mordecai. And he confesses or tells his wife and his friends there, his wise men, what's happening. And, Zeresh says, well, you're not going to be able to stand up against him. And I like, how encouraging his wife is. You're surely going to fall before him. So I don't know if she means that he's going to die at the hands in front of Mordecai, or whether he's going to be bowing before Mordecai. Perhaps bowing because of the pomp and circumstance that goes into this awarding of this ceremony. That perhaps Zeresh here, Haman's wife, can see that there's going to come a point here today where Haman's going to be bowing down to Mordecai. Comments or questions? Boy, are you kidding me?
You should have had more commentary on 5.
Yeah. Well, we can do chapter 7. It's only 10 verses, and I think at this point we know how it's going to go. So we'll just go ahead and go. Have we ever done 3 chapters in a setting?
No.
You would know more than us.
Oh. Well, Cynthia said no, and Tammy said no.
Yeah,
So.
but you know more.
Oh. All right. Well, these are short chapters, and there's not. It all plays out pretty easy. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll go to chapter 7. We'll go ahead and kill Haman here.
Oh, spoiler alert.
I think
Esther
everybody
7.
knew what was happening.
So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the 2nd day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom.
Now, I do want you to understand or remember that King Ahasuerus, he doesn't know anything about what's going on with what Esther wants, or essentially what Haman wants for Mordecai. He's going to this banquet expecting the queen to ask for a new wardrobe or who knows what. And perhaps maybe in some way he's thinking that Esther wants to honor Haman, because why else would Haman be invited? So understand that the king is clueless, so to speak, as to what actually is going to transpire here. But also understand that the king likes Mordecai. He's not an enemy. And Mordecai has been promoted in some ways into the government, so it's not like he's just some guy on the street. I mean, Mordecai does work for King Ahasuerus in some form or fashion. But obviously, at some point throughout this time frame, Haman had been promoted above Mordecai, but we don't understand why. But understand too that Mordecai was faithful to the king in all actions. So we get here to the second day, or the second banquet, and the king asks again, "What do you want, Queen Esther?" Now, here's where it all begins to fall apart or unfold or whatever you want to say. Verse 3.
Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request.
And something I forgot to say, too, is King Ahasuerus does not understand the proclamation that Haman gave to have all the Jews killed 11 months from now. Ahasuerus was completely oblivious to that, because he essentially gave Haman the right to do whatever he wanted, because he gave him the ring. And so it was Haman that came up with a plot to kill all the Jews. But it was the king's blessing, because the king had gave Haman the ring to sign the proclamation. So again, Ahasuerus, I don't know whether he just was oblivious and just didn't want to know, or whether he just was duped by everybody. But at this point, the king has no idea the plot that has been formed against not necessarily all the Jews, but also against his wife and against this trusted friend Mordecai. So as we go through this, understand that the king doesn't know what's going on. It may be good, it may be bad. I don't know. Verse 4, Esther continues to talk here.
For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he? And where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so?
So Esther says there in verse 4, we have been sold to be destroyed and to be and slain and perish. And notice what she says. Had we been sold as bondmen, or had we become slaves, I wouldn't have said anything. But we have had a bond put upon our head, so to speak, or a bounty, that all of us are going to be killed. And then the king says, now, think about Haman here. He's probably sitting right next to the king. And Esther is standing here, and she says what she said. Haman realizes, yeah. And then, like what the king said, who's come up with this plan? I just imagine Haman maybe would have done this. Moved his chair back and away from the king. But we see how it all plays out here. Who is he, and where is he that dares presume in his heart to do so? Verse 6.
And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine, in his wrath went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king.
I can see Esther pointing. Well, it's this guy right here, this wicked Haman that's sitting next to you. Obviously, we see here that the king was enraged because he got up and left. And now here Haman is pleading for his life in front of Esther. I mean, we could see this coming way back in chapter 6, chapter 5. Well, he left everything. I think he went to the other. Well, it says he went to the garden, so he even went outside. And Haman knows that he's the. I'm thinking here that Haman realizes something's going to happen to him, although he doesn't know what just yet. But the king went outside the garden. Haman stood up to make request to the queen because he could tell that the king was ticked off. Verse 8, and we're going to be finished.
Then the king returned out of the palace garden in place of the banquet of wine. And Haman was fallen upon the bed, whereon Esther was. Then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house?
Uh-oh.
As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face.
Now, I don't really know why. Perhaps he was trying to seduce her in some way. We don't really know. But not only is he ticked off because Haman wants to kill all the Jews, which includes his wife, but now apparently he's trying to seduce his wife to have his way with her. Well, that was it for the king. So they came in and covered Haman's face. You know, I can see him putting that burlap sack over his head now.
And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified.
So Haman gets hung on the gallows he made for Mordecai. Now, I'm going to give a preview about next week, but I want us to understand that the Persian kings would not change their decrees. You remember back in Daniel when the king made a decree that nobody could be worshipped except the king, and Daniel went and prayed to God in his window, which led to Daniel being put in the den of lions. Well, the king didn't want to, but that was the decree. And we've read off and on through Daniel and Ezra how the Persians do not change their decrees. So this decree that the slaughter of the Jews is still in effect. Now again, we've got at this point perhaps 9 or 10 months. Don't know for sure, but we know it was 11 months when the die was cast. So we've got, let's just say, 11 months to prepare, because he does not change this edict, although perhaps he wants to. Now, we're going to find a workaround about that when we get into chapter 8, but understand that this decree against the Jews is still in effect. Now, again, we could say, well, why don't they change their law? But the Persians always felt like their laws that their kings made was from their deities, from their gods. And so if their gods had decreed something and the king agreed to it, then there was no changing it. So that's why the decrees don't change. With that being said, Mordecai has now been avenged. Haman is now dead, hung on the gallows, and the king has been pacified against the wrath of toward Haman. Comments or questions?